panelists to the Developing Offshore Wind session, looking at some of the key issues and trends in the UK offshore wind sector.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this panel section. I assure if you already know about offshore wind, you'll definitely have a good time listening more about it. And if you haven't heard about it, probably you'll learn a lot more about the great UK success story. I'm Ravneet Kaur. I'm Senior Technology Acceleration Manager leading the supply chain innovation and investment programs and projects for Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. Offshore Renewable Energy Catapults is the UK's leading technology, innovation, and research center for offshore renewable energy. We play a key role in delivering UK's net zero target by accelerating the creation of and growth of UK companies in offshore renewable sector. We use our unique 400 million pounds of testing facility and expert research and engineering capabilities to bring together industry, policymakers, and academia to drive innovation in the sector. Today, we are going to discuss about UK's ambitious deployment targets of 50 gigawatts by 2030, enabling UK to achieve energy security. We're going to discuss the past, present, and the future of offshore wind sector, hearing from our esteemed expert panelists representing varied facets of offshore wind sector, that is industry, government, policy, economic development associations. To set the context for this panel session, let me briefly talk about offshore wind sector in the UK. UK government has set an ambitious target, I would like to say realistic, not ambitious, target of generating 40 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030. That means we need to deploy nearly 4 gigawatts of offshore wind every year to achieve that target. This plan aims to significantly increase the deployment of offshore wind in the UK waters, supporting countries' transition to a low-carbon economy whilst generating thousands of jobs. Offshore wind energy has emerged as a key player in UK's transition towards a more sustainable and renewable energy future. With the UK's vast coastline and strong wind, offshore wind farm isn't a surprise to become an attractive option for meeting the growing demands of the energy needs in the country and also achieving the carbon emissions, reducing the carbon emissions. Offshore wind now is dubbed as the new oil and is the great UK success story of the century. By 2030, half of the power is going to come from offshore wind sector. UK is home to world's 5 largest offshore wind farms and have second largest, biggest pipeline of projects globally, closely to China. Each gigawatt of new offshore wind will add nearly 2 to 3 billion of value to UK economy, and this sector supports nearly 30,000 jobs. Innovation, research, development in the offshore wind sector in the last decade has enabled the offshore wind to be at the heart of the net zero transition, and from an expensive, immature technology, which it used to be called, now it is becoming the lowest cost source of UK power. UK has led the innovation in offshore wind by using its excellent engineering skills and scaled it to the industrialized wind solutions. According to the World Economic Council 2023 Energy Outlook, over 380 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity is going to be deployed all over the world. It amounts to nearly $1.3 trillion domestic and international market opportunity. And we here are going to discuss that with our esteemed panelists. So I will now move on to, and requesting our panelists to introduce themselves and share their views of what they think offshore wind's role is in the UK energy mix. Zoe.
Hi, I'm Zoe Barnes. I wear a few hats. My day job's in offshore wind strategy with a company called Everoze, but I also lead the UK's floating wind task force as we transition into floating wind. And I'm a non-exec in both the National Composite Centre and a non-exec in an organisation called the Offshore Wind Growth Partnership, which has the remit to deliver economic growth for offshore wind in the UK. You asked the question what the role of offshore wind should be. I think I'd just like to give an example of where we've come from. I've been offshore wind now for 20 years, and the role now is so different to where it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, and even 10 years ago, we were very much an industry in its childhood. We were naive, enthusiastic, and dare I say it, driven by sock and sandal wearing, genuinely visionaries who were very much had a concept they wanted to get off the ground. I'd say over the last 5 years, we've transitioned to an industry that's in its adolescence. And we've seen the growing pains for that, and anybody in the industry will have felt those growing pains, and we can't deny those, around commercialization, around technology, around cost, around what it takes to play on a global stage. And we've learned those lessons, and we are learning those lessons. And now we're taking up what I believe is our rightful role as we move forward as an adult sector, a mature sector, and we've earned our place and our rightful place, I think, on the central stage, talking about both the role of offshore wind in the energy sector and delivery of a secure energy system, the role of offshore wind in net zero, and also the role of offshore wind in economic development in the UK.
Hi, everyone. My name is Susanna. Oh, don't know if you can hear me. I think that's better. My name is Susanna, and I work on offshore wind investment in the Department for Business and Trade. So my day job is supporting potential investors who would like to come to the UK and set up manufacturing assets here, building our domestic supply chain. So great points raised by Zoe and Ravneet about the role offshore wind has to play in our energy system. We have a 50 gigawatt ambition by 2030. The ambition is huge. The potential is even greater. Zoe's touched upon some of the economic growth that could come from offshore wind, and I love that stat that Ravneet highlighted at the start, that every gigawatt pours £2 to £3 billion of investment into our industry, into our economy, excuse me. I just think it's a really exciting time for offshore wind. There's a huge drive behind government. We've got funding available in the form of the Green Industries Growth Accelerator to support projects, investors interested in building manufacturing assets here. We've also got Industry's Industrial Growth Plan, which was launched a few weeks ago, which is where industry drew together what they believe is the vision to grow the UK offshore wind industry. And I just believe now is a really exciting time to push forward offshore wind when they're everywhere, be it in the EU, UK, even the US, are all trying to ramp up their targets for offshore wind because they realise the prominent role it can play in our energy system, in helping us reach net zero, and of course our economy.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invite to come here today. My name's Gordon McIntosh. I'm chairman of Aberdeen International Associates and a director of the Aberdeen Renewable Energy Group, based in the northeast of Scotland. I have a number of other hats I won't go into at the moment. But in terms of where we see ourselves in Aberdeen, we've been very fortunate, if you like, to be in the early days of offshore wind. AREG was a partner with originally AMEC and then latterly Vattenfall in the development of the European Offshore Wind Deployment Centre in Aberdeen, and I was lucky enough to be a director of that. But we've seen, in Aberdeen, this transition and the start of the transition, which we started 20 years ago when AREG was formed, to diversify the oil and gas industry into renewables. And that early focus on wind and innovation related to wind. And that's what it was all about, the European Offshore Wind Innovation Centre, moving from 10 metres out to 30 metres. But since then, we've seen Aberdeen sitting there at the centre of that area covered by ScotWind, having an increasing role and an increasingly important part in that transition. So it's an exciting time as we go forward. I see, the next 10, 15 years associated with the 25 to 30 gig that there is associated with ScotWind. There will be some real transmission challenges there. So we will be looking at much of that going to hydrogen production. And as we develop out and we see, we can speak maybe more about how far how big each individual wind turbine can get. But as we develop out, that's going to be very, very important going forward, and it's going to play a key role in Britain's position with regard to energy, with the renewable energy piece in particular.
Thanks, Gordon. Afternoon, everyone. My name is Gary Connolly, and I'm head of offshore wind development in the UK for ESB. Now, I suspect if I ask people for a show of hands and ask them who ESB are, most people are probably not aware. ESB are an Irish utility. We were the monopoly state-owned utility company in Ireland, and we still have a significant share of the Irish market, both in terms of generation, transmission and supply of electricity. For more than 30 years now, ESB has seen its home market as Ireland, obviously, but also the UK. And we've been active in the UK primarily in conventional generation. But as with every other utility company, we've seen and understand the need to move towards net zero. So offshore wind is a key part of what ESB strategy is between now and 2040. So we have a net zero 2040 ambition, which is not uncommon in terms of the industry that we work in. So why offshore wind? So for me, offshore wind is the engine room of a green economy. It's the technology that has the potential to move the dial. I think the UK has been and continues to be a market leader in the context of the delivery of offshore wind. What's going to shift the dial then in terms of getting from where we are today, which has been a tremendous success story, to 2040, so 2030, 2040, and 2050? There's probably three things that are important. The first one is actually partnership. We're not involved really in any projects that don't involve a partnership with someone else. And the reason for that is because the scale of investment that is required is so high, and the risk is so high that it's important to spread that risk. So effective partnerships in offshore wind are critical. Route to market is also critical. As was rightly pointed out, the offshore wind now is the single cheapest source of electricity in the UK market, but it's a really high risk business because unlike traditional forms of generation, for offshore wind, you take all of your money and you spend it at the start before you generate any income. And that's a real challenge. So, and it's really high risk. So a successful route to market is critically important. And the third one, and it goes back to what Gordon was talking about, is around the piece and the supply chain. And the supply chain, if you work in the supply chain in offshore wind at the minute, you're on the pig's back because the supply chain is not big enough to facilitate what we are trying to do as an industry in terms of develop the projects. If you go to the market today and try to source vessels to build these projects, if you're lucky, people will talk to you about vessels being available in 2028 and 2029. So those are the three key aspects from my point of view in relation to offshore wind. We need partnerships, we need successful route to market, and we need an effective supply chain.
Thank you very much for introducing and starting a great conversation. 3 points, Gary. I think I completely take your point. Collaboration is at the heart of our sector, making it happen from the 20 years ago. Zoe, which you mentioned, innovation, route to market, all the things required. I think I'll go back to Susanna's point of investment, and I hear you saying investments is already underway, but we have heard from the industry players what's happening on ground, collaboration. So how the UK will retain its #1 position? What could enable it, and what are the policies which are happening right now to make it happen?
So that's a really great question. I think I'm just going to start by setting, oh God, this microphone. I'm going to start by setting the scene for offshore wind here in the UK. So we are the country with the second largest pipeline of installed projects after China. We have about 14.7 gigawatts in the system with a pipeline nearing 100 gigawatts. So lots of room for potential. In fact, I read there's a statistic that between 2022 and 2030, to reach our ambition of 50 gigawatts by 2030, we would need £155 billion of investment to get these projects into the system. So that is a colossal amount of money. So the government's main tool for creating a positive investor environment for offshore wind is our flagship Contracts for Difference Renewable Subsidy Scheme. So this is a scheme where, as Gary mentioned at the start, offshore wind is a high-risk venture. A lot of the risk and financing has to be poured in at the start of these projects. These projects, I believe, take about 10 years from the start to final inception. So they're long-term investments. And what government did was create a scheme where we would provide a guaranteed price for 15 years, so that developers could get a guaranteed return for their electricity. And this made offshore wind incredibly bankable. So at the start of the scheme, we had, I think the strike price was about 120 megawatts per hour. And over 4 allocation rounds, that dropped to £44 per megawatt hour in allocation round 4. Now, those of you who have been following offshore wind in the UK for a while might be aware that in allocation round 5, so last year's allocation round, we didn't secure any bids for offshore wind. Now, this was a failure on our part. Our methodology didn't reflect, or the calculations that we used to create the strike price didn't reflect the macroeconomic pressures and the struggles that the industry was facing last year due to inflation pressures, rampant demand for supply chain across the piece exacerbated by Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So government has kind of taken that all on board. We've increased our administered strike prices for the upcoming allocation round. So that closed very recently, and results are going to come into summer. So for context, we've increased the price for fixed bottom by 66% compared to last year, and similarly for floating by over 50%, because we recognize that we need to be more flexible in our calculations and ensure that we create the best environment for those investments, especially as at the moment the environment has been a little bit tricky for offshore wind. So that would be my first point. We've got contract for difference. And then, of course, we've spoken a little bit about supply chain. The global market is severely constrained. Everyone is trying to create more offshore wind projects. So we've launched the Green Industries Growth Accelerator, which I mentioned at the start. So this is a fund of over £1 billion to support manufacturing in key net zero industries in the UK, of which £390 million will be available for offshore wind and networks projects. Because we know that if we want to get these projects into the system, we need to have the supply chain there to service the industry. Again, we recognise that costs are really high. It's a difficult time for the industry, be it developers, suppliers. So we're also introducing sustainable industry rewards, which is our version of non-price factors that have been implemented across Europe. And this is where we're willing to, we're prepared to provide a top-up to developers on the contract for difference, so to reward people who decide to make more sustainable decisions in terms of sourcing supply chains, so that the lowest cost driver isn't the main reason in driver behind your procurement decisions. And all of this, we hope, will kind of create a better environment for A, to get more projects on board, and B, to grow the supply chain with us so that we can create long-term sustainability for the industry.
Thank you, Susanna. I think you have already touched on the point which we got from the audience is, does the current CFD licensing mechanism needs to change to accommodate it? I think you briefly touched upon it, that government is already working on it.
Sorry, I missed that question.
Can you hear me?
Better now.
Better, okay, great. Is it better?
This is better.
Perfect. Does the current CFD licensing mechanism need to change to accommodate and drive expansions for offshore wind? So that's a question from the audience. And I think you've briefly touched upon it, that what government is doing, and in regards to the incentives as well. But do you think does it need a complete rehaul or restructuring, or an improvement on it would really work?
I don't think the contract for difference needs a complete rehaul. Like I said in my previous answer, it's been really successful in driving down the cost of offshore wind from 120 in 2012 to 44 megawatts per hour in 2022. I think there is something to be said that we continuously update our methodology for calculating the strike price for the contract for difference, and that is really connected to what industry are telling us. Real-world data reflects what's going on in other markets. I don't think what happened last year was unique to the UK. We saw that the US have really struggled. I mean, they have a different series of problems, but they've also struggled with the financing of their projects. So I think it's been, if you like, a bit of a wake-up call for government to realise that the lowest cost driver can't be our continued approach to offshore wind.
Great. Thanks. Zoe, what are your views? Obviously, you have worked in and out and in industry, government, in the task force.
Yeah. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, I'd have said yes. The CFD mechanism is borderline doing more harm than good. As the CFD mechanism was driving prices down and down and down and down and down, which was in line with what the industry needed to do in 2013, 2014, 2015, but it was driving it down to a point where developers were bidding in and they just simply couldn't deliver at that price. The CFD was doing harm. It was driving the wrong behaviours. It wasn't driving UK content. It wasn't driving economic benefit. It was driving an absolute race to the bottom. So if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I'd have said yes. But actually, AR5, I think, taught us all a lesson. When AR5 is when no one bid, and I think that gave us all a wake-up call. I talked about being our adolescent phase. That was one of our critical learnings. We can't continue to drive the prices down. There is a bottom. And I think the government has done a fantastic job of going, okay, yeah, no, we pushed them too hard, and it's been revised, and the strike prices, the value we get for the electricity, has significantly increased. So now I think it's not doing the harm it was. And I think the other major change that I would have said was a criticism of CFD was the lack of teeth in ensuring UK economic development. But with the sustainable industry awards coming in, if they're implemented well, then I think the CFD's two major issues with the CFD should be addressed as we move into the next leasing rounds.
Okay. I think following up on that point, in terms of attracting inward investment, what specific measures we need to have in place to make sure that UK has the advantage it has currently, and it still remains in an advantage for the next 10 years until 2015 or 10, obviously. Let's be the great British success story as we are for other heavy engineering sectors.
So if I'm sitting here, looking at the globe, looking where to invest in projects, and we have to recognise it's a global market. Nobody's just sitting in the UK thinking, there's no UK developers, perhaps with the exception of ESP at the end, who are sitting and saying, where should we invest our money? They're looking on a global scale. And there's kind of two major things that I'm looking for in a global in any market. One is confidence in long-term government commitment, and the other is a manageable level of risk in getting my specific project into the water. And that confidence is built, in my opinion, in 5 ways. One is government signalling, whether that's formal targets, whether that's just a minister turning up at a conference and some of the rhetoric around it. That government signalling that there's a commitment there. And it has to be a long-term commitment, because a decision made now to invest in a project won't realise generation for anywhere between about 8 and 15 years. So, I'm looking for long-term signals now that I've still got the support mechanisms and the infrastructure investment needed, et cetera, in 15 years' time. So one is long-term signals from the government. 2 is stability of the support mechanism. There's another reason not to mess too much with the CFD, is I want to know that support mechanism, I want to know what the support mechanism is going to look like by the time I get there, and that the support mechanism can adjust according to macroeconomic and industry conditions. Number 2. Number 3 is I need to know the infrastructure is going to be in place. And that's a huge challenge as the industry grows. And that's grid in the UK, and it's ports. And the moment there's absolute bottlenecks at once. If I'm looking at market and go, do you know, I can't get a grid connection for 20 years. It's game over, I'll go to somewhere else. And the next one is long-term visibility of seabed leasing, because I probably won't invest in a region or a country if I can just see there's one seabed leasing round. I want to see there's a seabed leasing round now, and the next one's going to be in 2 years, and the next one's going to be two. And therefore, I can make the investment needed in a region to actually make it happen. And that's particularly important if I'm looking at supply chain. And the last one, which is a quite project-specific one, is I need to know what the consenting regime looks like. I need to know that there's limited risk that I'm going to get consent for my project, because I don't want to spend 5 years and £10 million getting to a point where someone says, oh, actually, either this is not consentable, or the regulators don't have the resources in-house to actually see it through, and it causes a 2-year delay, and I miss my next auction for my subsidy. So I guess, for me, those are kind of the 5 things that we really need to ensure we make happen in the UK to make it a globally competitive market.
That's brilliant. I think just talking about the investments which we need to make and how we need to do it, I think I'm looking at Gary there, and obviously you guys are making huge investments in the UK, and you said the offshore wind is going to be the heart or the kind of core for making the transition happen. So from an industry perspective, do you think all these mechanisms are in place which are facilitating your inward investment to the UK? And what's happening right? What happened in 10 years ago? And what do you think is going to happen in next 10 years?
So I think as developers, we will always, we'll always complain. It's always in our nature to complain. But in reality, so the UK has been a stable market and a mature market, and it's a good place to do business from our point of view. So it's interesting. I have a slightly different take on the CFD regime than some of my colleagues, in the sense that I think what has happened is that so the supply chain, and there's no doubt that the CFD has driven the supply chain in a particular direction, but the supply chain has been able to keep up with the CFD. So up until allocation round 4, the CFD support scheme basically delivered a price that was slightly in excess of what the supply chain costs were. So when you bid into an auction up until AR4, you were reasonably sure that by the time you came to build the project, the actual cost of delivery would be lower than the cost expected in the CFD round. So AR4 everything went out the window, in the sense that by the time we came to build projects in AR4, the actual capex involved in building the project was higher than what was allowed for under the AR4 regime. That's exactly what happened in AR5, and that's why, as Susanna mentioned, there were no bids in AR5, because the price that was allocated wasn't sufficient to incentivize the developers to build the projects out. AR6, I think, will be really interesting, and it's good to see the government taking on board the feedback, but there's two very important elements to the way that is supported. The first one is the price, and the government have absolutely taken that on board and given a sufficiently high strike price that means the projects can be built. The problem I think we're going to run up against is that the budget that's actually allocated to the round isn't sufficient. As opposed at one perspective. But if the objective of net zero was to try and build as much green generation as possible, we need to make sure that the auction rounds are not designed in such a way that they prevent projects from going forward. The projects have to be competitive, but they also need to make sure that there's a sufficient volume of projects that are taken through. And there's a concern in the development community at the minute that there's gigawatts of capacity available that could compete in AR6, but the budget that's available in AR6 is not sufficient to allow all those projects to be taken forward. And that's a real concern for us. So in the context of investment, I think that CFD round is the first key, that CFD process is the first measure for us as an industry in terms of being able to take the first decisions. As I say, I have been involved directly and indirectly in markets across the world, and the UK should take pride in what it's done. It's very stable. You have a seabed allocation, you get consent for your project, you apply for a CFD, hopefully you get a grid connection, and then you build the project. So it's stable and it's well understood, and it's a credit to what has happened. But I think it still there's a few tweaks needed around the edges to make sure that it actually brings forward the volume of generation that's actually needed for us to meet 2030 and 2050 targets.
Thanks, Gary. I think it's great and interesting to hear from your perspective as a developer from the regulatory side. What do you think are the opportunities and challenges of making the offshore wind happen from the technology and the innovation side? Do you think we are mature enough, we have got everything right and we have done it, or there's a lot more we still need to work to make it happen?
So we're absolutely at a pivot point in the sector now, because pretty much all of the work that has been done to date has been done in what's called fixed bottom turbines. So fundamentally, you put a fixed foundation in the ground and you put a turbine on top of that. And other than you have to put the foundation in the water, that's pretty much the same as building a turbine onshore. the UK and others have been successfully doing that now for 20 years, and that's why the price has come down, so that offshore wind is actually the cheapest form of generation that's available to us. The innovation that's going to come, that needs to come now, is in relation to floating wind, because there are not that many site opportunities left around the UK for fixed bottom. Like, obviously the depth is the thing that constrains the ability to install fixed bottom foundations, and so we need to move to floating. Now, Gordon will tell me, and rightly so, that the technology we're using for floating offshore wind is not new. It's been around for 30 plus years in the context of offshore oil and gas platforms. So the technology itself is well understood and is there. The deployment in the context of offshore wind then is a wee bit tricky, and there are a couple of things around that. So one is it's really complex to install a cable that's attached to a floating object, because the cable by definition has to move, and that causes a flexion in the cable and can cause all sorts of problems. And the other big headache that we have is actually, at the minute, we build offshore turbines from a fixed platform onto a fixed platform. So the foundation is fixed and the installation platform in terms of the vessel is fixed. And that makes it relatively straightforward because nothing moves. Okay. But when we get the floating technology, and we haven't got here yet, but what we need to do is be in a position to be able to install a turbine from a floating platform onto a floating foundation. Now that sounds simple, but if you can imagine, if we're talking about 120, 140 meter hub height and more, and you have a vessel with a crane on it that moves, and you have a foundation that moves, and you're trying to bolt the blade on, you can imagine how complicated that is. So from a technology point of view, that's where the innovation, I think, is going to have to come from in terms of really taking the next step forward in floating offshore wind. Currently, the floating offshore wind is almost exclusively built at a quayside and then towed out to the point of deployment. And that's fine for testing the technology, but in terms of long-term sustainability, it's not going to work, because we're going 100, 200 kilometers offshore, and it doesn't make sense to bring those turbines back to shore if they need significant repair.
I think for that purpose, we have just launched a floating offshore wind center of excellence, where we are wanting to de-risk and make this happen and make floating offshore wind the success story and retain the growth. I think I'll come to Gordon. I think a nice segue to the Aberdeen Bay and all the experience you have been doing in the region to kind of promote the economical development, not only the economical development, but also the social development side of things of this sector brings in to the coastal regions. So would love to hear your views on how this has enabled Northeast Scotland and what's the transition been from the oil and gas to the offshore wind world.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the question. And just to build on what the previous speakers were saying, that flexibility that's required going forward in relation to the next rounds, and that consistency is very important, because there is a growing international competition. We've still got a lead, and we've still got a bit of headway, but there will be a growing amount of competition. And I just want to go backwards a little bit to the importance of that system and go back to rocks, in fact, because I remember in 2012 being lucky enough to visit Highwind's pilot off Stavanger and speaking to what was called the Statoil team at that time, the Equinor team, and the importance. They said that they were establishing Highwind at Peterhead, which was the first floating in the world. They were establishing it there because of the rock system. And they were able to take the chance round about that first floating commercial piece because of the support that was available from the British government. So that's really important. And then you look at the Kincardine project, what is now flotation wind, and the work that was done there again. That only happened because of the rock system that was in place at that time. And that gave us a huge advantage and a lead going forward. We were delighted to see that, and getting back to the question about Aberdeen's role in all of this. We have had 180,000 people in Aberdeen and North Eastern Scotland employed in oil and gas. And we've been, as AREG, working for the last 21, 22 years in trying to transition the supply chain into renewables gradually. It's been a difficult job because every time the oil price went up, the interest went down. But now we're seeing a real development of of innovatory type products in the northeast of Scotland. And ETZ, and thanks to the support of the Catapult, the opening of that floating offshore wind centre of excellence is going to be important. Earlier, it was last week there was the announcement that Greenvolt are going ahead with their project to supply electricity to offshore oil and gas platforms. Now, on the way in here today, I had a call from Alan McCaskill, who was one of the founding directors of AREG, just off chance, and he was saying, look, Gordon, we need to get together to help develop the supply chain in the north and northeast of Scotland, as well as the wider UK, to be sure that we can deliver in this project. They've got a very fast line in relation to being able to deliver the project. Now, they want to work to develop and work with the supply chain to help Aberdeen in terms of its transition, which is going to be, accelerated as well as we move from oil and gas. But we've got some real key developers interested in moving forward rapidly. But that skills piece is absolutely vital. I was at a previous presentation earlier today here, and we don't have enough individuals, never mind companies in the supply chain, we don't have enough individuals with the right skills in place at this moment in time to meet the demands of delivering ScotWind. So if you're looking at 30 gigawatts by 2035, I'll say now, we're going to need an awful lot of people. So we need to capture those people who are already in the oil and gas industry, but building that with young people coming through the educational system to be sure that we've got the skills to deliver on all those projects. So yeah, that's...
Karan, you have hit a nail in the head right here, right? Talking about the skills, the requirement. Obviously, we talked about the challenge of the supply chain. I think I'll come back to that point. But before that, I think I'll bring Zoe in from the floating offshore wind. What's happening? What's the government task force doing about it? How can we kind of grow on that innovation? And what do we need to do now? Again, innovation-wise, dynamic cables being touched by Gary as being the challenge of making it possible. What's happening?
So I think, as my fellow panelists stated, we're on a transition point in offshore wind in the UK, where projects are needing to build out in deeper water and they're needing to build out further offshore, which has its challenges. It has its advantages in terms of it's further offshore and there's more wind, but it absolutely has its challenges. And our price point for floating wind at the moment is, what are we on at the moment? I'll look down there for what are we on? Give me 100.
It's nearly double the price
Yeah,
of fixed
it's
bottom.
about 170. Is that fair?
Yeah.
So 170 pounds a megawatt versus more like 70 for fixed bottom. So we're moving towards a new technology that we need to ensure the future markets and future deployment in the UK. But we've got two really big challenges. One is how to bring the cost down, so it's a competitive form of electricity generation. And the other is we need a hell of a lot of infrastructure to build out these things. We need at least another 3 major port upgrades to get close to developing what we've got in the pipeline. I mean, that's billions. Estimates around 6 billion investment in ports to make that happen. So whilst there's technology challenges, and I say that, to my mind, they focus mainly around cost reduction, there's infrastructure challenges. And the third major challenge is manufacturing. We need hundreds of these. At the moment, we've made a maximum of time for a project. Are we 7 or 8? How are we going to turn this kind of bespoke new technology into a rapid manufacturing production line to get these things in the water as fast as we need to? And that's something we're trying to grasp as an industry at the moment. I mean, in terms of what the task force is doing, we've been looking at what's viable in terms of deployment, and we've got a big report coming out at Global Offshore Wind. We've been looking at what are the levers we can pull to reduce those costs and how do we make them happen. We've been looking at how we can realize the socio-economic benefit. How do we make sure, as we reach this new horizon and this opportunity, which really well plays into the UK's strengths of maritime engineering, deep water, our skill base, how do we actually realize that in the UK? All this is coming out in a vision statement that's coming out at Global Offshore Wind, that we're really going to try and set the direction of what can be achieved with floating wind and what we need to do to get there.
Great. We will have 5 gigawatts by 2030. That's the ambition UK has set out
Sorry?
to. We'll have 5 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2030. That's the ambition UK has set out.
And-
We will reach there one way or the other. That's kind of my half glass full approach. Where there are challenges, there are opportunities.
And we think we can get, looking realistically, to around a fifth of the UK's energy generated from floating wind by 2050. So it's going to become a major energy source. It's going to need to.
And not only here, I think there's a huge export opportunity as well, where we don't have shallow waters like we have in the UK. And I think if we have the lead and we can take the lead to make it happen, de-risk the technology, create the manufacturing requirement, the infrastructure requirement, and be the world leaders, then probably we can have the pie of the share of that 1.3 trillion market cap.
I mean, by 2050, it's estimated to be a £1 trillion market. Our analysis shows the UK can perhaps capture £22 billion worth of that. I mean, we are globally leading at the moment. We have the most floating wind installed capacity. We had the first 2 commercial projects in the water, and our pipeline for floating wind is as big as anywhere in the world. So we actually have the ability, if we act now and we invest now, to take that global lead and realize quite a lot of that export market. It won't be an export market for great big platforms, which is where people's heads tend to go, but in terms of services, in terms of technology, in terms of IP, absolutely.
Brilliant. Impossible also says I am possible. So that's the only thing I'm thinking when I'm thinking about floating offshore wind. On the cynics in the room who are thinking floating offshore wind, it is going to happen. That's kind of my...
It is going to happen.
It is going to happen. So then I'm going to come on that point of the export opportunity here and the inward investment. What are we doing in collaboration with other governments, other international organizations? Are we sharing best practices? Are we enabling policy? What are we currently doing to enable that future growth, which we are seeing nearly like 500 gigawatts are going to be going into water for next 10 years? What's happening in the international space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've just been in the US attending an offshore wind conference over there. Why is that relevant? Because the UK recently signed a US-UK Atlantic Declaration, of which offshore wind featured. And this was all about lessons learned, best practice. We've heard about oil and gas. We've heard about the transferability of skills. That's something that government definitely wants to push forward. I believe 90 to 100,000 jobs are going to be required by 2030. And bringing us back to that US point, now the US had a very prominent role in helping set up the oil and gas industry in the North Sea. A lot of American companies came. And in a way, I kind of see us going back to the US and helping them build up their offshore wind industry. We've spoken about floating. The west coast of the US is going to be mostly floating. We've been really lucky here in the UK in that our geology is we have a lot of shallow seabed, which has kind of made us the perfect environment to build fixed bottom. But in fact, I think it's something like 90% of the world's offshore wind potential is floating. So it's something that we definitely need and something that we can kind of shift from fixed bottom to floating and really capitalize on that world-leading edge that we have right now.
Great, thanks. And I think going back to Gordon's points of skills, and we've talked about skills task force, we'll need people, we've talked about the manufacturing and infrastructure, but it is people we'll need more than anything else to make this happen as well. So would like to touch upon your experience of what's happening in Aberdeen in that space as well.
Yes, certainly. There's been a major piece of work done by Robert Gordon University in relation to looking at projected skills needs going forward across sectors, not just in wind, but also in hydrogen, where we've had a big focus on hydrogen. And so a task force has been brought together to look at what's needed there, and ETZ, which is a private sector organisation backed by the Scottish and UK governments, they've established a skills centre of excellence building on the work that ASET used to do in the international oil and gas industry. So all of that is part of a movement going forward to ensure that we have the skills coming through from the schools to the colleges and the universities. But we don't see it as a North East Scotland piece. It's a whole UK piece. And you can see what's happening in Teesside and Humberside and the excitement that there is there, but another focus on skills and skills development. But we need to be sure that at the grassroots level in schools, that we do put enough effort into those elements to be sure that that the the workforce of the future is inspired to work in this industry. And I think there is quite a challenge there, because we're hearing that, at this moment in time, there's not enough coming through the pipeline in relation to those individuals wanting to get involved in this industry. It's a lot better than the oil and gas industry was, but it's still huge challenges there to enable us to do that.
Great, thanks. I think on that note, I think I'll wrap up the session, and thanks all the panelists for joining me today here and all of you for joining us today. Conclusion is always has to be positive, right? In conclusion, UK's ambitions to expand offshore wind capacity is realistic, not ambitious. We talked about 40 gigawatts. Yes, I know some of the questions said 50 gigawatts. The reason I said 40 was because it's realism, right? So we are going to reach 50 gigawatts by 2030, 100%. Floating offshore wind is happening 100%. By fostering a supportive policy environment, engaging with the key stakeholders, industry, driving the innovation, leveraging our expertise, UK can remain the attractive place for the inward investment in offshore wind power market. The transition to a more sustainable and self-reliant energy system is within reach, and UK has definitely the opportunity to lead its way. Thank you, and highly appreciate for you all joining us today.